voir si ça marche, YouTube. Oui, l'autre, c'est Twitch. Ok, Twitch, c'est bon. La vidéo, arrête. Tu veux une tasse de thé?
Ça va, merci. Oui, 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 oui.
C'est ça quand même.
Il y a toujours ce problème du son. Merci bien.
Donc, on est en streaming.
Ok. Négatif. Pas mal.
Tu sais, YouTube ne veut pas prendre. Ouais.
Ah merde, j'ai mon fond d'écran débile.
Ouais. Moi, Samuel, Richard,
Hi,
hello, Richard.
Hello, Richard. You hear us?
I can hear you. Yes, absolutely.
Okay, I can hear you too.
Where are
Shall we
you?
start? Just
In 3 minutes, it's okay for you? 3 minutes? Yeah, good. C'est vite en téléphone.
Hmm.
C'est peut-être à 55, tu fais l'introduction, et puis j'arrive, je vais
Ok.
je peux faire mon téléphone.
Can I just check that my screen sharing works? I can't seem to screen share. You'll need to give me
Yeah.
permissions.
Just try. Normally, it's seamless. You should just try. It's the like a green icon on the bottom.
Yeah, so it says you've disabled participant screen sharing. So you need to make me host,
Ah.
or you need to.
Okay. Sorry, because I don't think I know. Plusieurs participants peuvent partager.
Yeah, that sounds right.
Okay,
Yep,
here
great. That looks good.
it's okay. Fine.
Can you see my presentation now?
Yeah. All right. Perhaps we should start right now. So welcome for this second day of conversation and talks. The aim is to invite researcher, theoretician, and artist to develop the concept of the exhibition we just de-installed right now. We're just de-installing right now at Le Commun in Geneva. And so today is more focused on the participating artists and collectives. And we will start with Richard Ames from Crude Future, a collective that was founded, can I say post-pandemic of some sort?
So it was actually founded during the pandemic, but I'll talk about that in my talk.
Yeah. So they're based in Berlin. You can find their merch and eponymous journal, Crude Future, on New Models website. Perhaps you can also talk more about the foundings and how this project will evolve. And they developed a game called How It Happens, which is like a game based on the concept of collapse, which is also a critique of this notion. Through card games and a role play, and we had a session here at Le Commun during the exhibition. And so, Richard, maybe I can say also your pseudonym. No,
of course, if you want. Yeah.
As a Sam Moore, no, you participate to a podcast also on a New Model podcast, and more recently you presented also the game How It Happens and Crude Future on the New Model podcast. I can warmly recommend. And so I give you the floor. The floor is yours, and we can also interact after for more short question.
Thank you so much, Sam. Yes, I should say also the undername Sam Moore I also wrote some books about the far right, but that's another life, a lifetime ago. Hello, everyone. Do you want me to start my presentation? Yeah,
yes.
Great, cool, okay. So I'm going to be talking about this game here. My name is Richard Hames, as Sam said. Behind me, there is this extraordinary diagram by Matisse Gross-Kaufmann-Manis, which forms part of this card game and this poster, and then this thing, which I'm going to try and not have disappear into its own diagram, Crude Futures, which is a kind of very glossy magazine of almost 100 pages, which we put together as a collective. Where to talk about the origins? The group started after several failed attempts by myself to instill a sense of urgency in my immediate friendship group about the prospect of social collapse. I thought in early 2020 that it seemed very likely, I think like lots of people, that the pandemic was not going to be just a passing blip or a process of sort of immediate disaster, but precipitated a much longer, a much more substantial moment to which society in some ways definitively turns towards a long downturn. There are lots of basis for this idea. Was the idea that pandemics often have these unexpected kinds of effects. From the vantage point now, it perhaps seems like that was preemptive. That seems like the pandemic was in fact quite successfully subsumed into the overall architecture of capitalism, and in fact merely accelerated moments of social transformation that were already underway rather than causing a wide-scale collapse. That's, of course, a question that we can explore further. But the point is really here that epistemically, it felt like it was very difficult to get people to care about this possibility, that the kinds of lives they expected to lead over the course of the 21st century, largely young people in my friendship group, mid-20s at that point, tried to get them to take seriously the idea that, in fact, they might not live those lives, and that the kinds of lives they might be able to live were maybe curtailed or going to be buffeted around or going to be, in some ways, organized differently than how they expected them. Achille Mbembe has this very useful phrase, which is useful because of its mundanity or because of its simplicity, where he says that it seemed like in those moments, people might have to go through more than they expected to go through. This is a very sort of simple, in some ways, open way of phrasing it, but I think it really gets to the heart of the matter in some sense. And so, having failed to instill the sense of urgency in my friendship group immediately around me, I turned, as I think lots of people did in 2020, to online communities. Of course, all communities in some sense were online in those first few months of lockdown for almost everyone, apart from people you perhaps live with or people you saw at the shop, but particularly the New Models server. And we're very grateful that New Models allowed us to incubate this idea inside their server in one of the channels in the Discord server. I recommend people join that if they're not already members. And that incubation allowed us to essentially grow a kind of a framework for thinking about collapse. It's a framework that is not robust deliberately. It's a framework that is always teetering on the edge. It's a framework that is always, in some sense, leaky and open to the, in some ways, epistemic chaos of the current moment, the feeling that too much is happening simultaneously to be really grasped by any one framework. And so in lieu of a kind of a single object, what we ultimately produced after 2 years almost of continuous discussions every single week, extraordinary levels of commitment, which I had not found elsewhere. So I have to thank the participants enormously for that. We decided to collectively produce a magazine, which again, I'm going to hold up and try and get it to not disappear into the background, called Crude Futures. And the magazine is in some ways a sort of refraction of this epistemic anxiety, this feeling that in some ways the world is too much. There are too many things. And that project, it contains collective writing from members of the collective, in the form of an introduction. It contains individual articles produced by individual members, of which I will now tell you some of them. We have Planet Out of Joint by Bo Caprice Vetch, which produces a very intricate argument about the relationship between worlds and planets. We have Bodies on the Wheel, Just Stop Oil by Jake Colvin, which is a very humane and I think quite sympathetic portrait of activists in Just Stop Oil, which is a British activist group whose activities are to attempt to stop new oil and gas licenses in the North Sea. It's a climate change based group. And their work in some ways embodies this spirit of martyrdom, this feeling that they need to sacrifice themselves for some greater good. And that he produces a very humane portrait of the kinds of politics that are licensed by the feeling of the end of the world. What it is that the feeling of the end of the world allows us to then do. The Weakest Link, which is about supply chains, by Jack Tarpey, which offers a very succinct and I think prescient reading of supply chain crises in the pandemic, in all their sort of comedy and in some ways their difficulty as well. The comedy being, of course, this famous boat that got stuck in the Suez Canal. Extremely funny, probably the funniest thing to have happened for a very long time. And punctuating these, as I should say, as we go through, a series of vignettes, one-page vignettes by Mina Miller, these excellent sort of short stories that conjure certain kinds of worlds. I won't go through the entire magazine. I will skip over my own piece, which is called Social Scurvy, and go on to Picturing Polycrisis, which you are looking at behind me. This extraordinary diagram that in some ways tries to absorb all the kinds of multifaceted dimensions of the current crisis, and at the same time explode them into nonsense, right? So there's kind of this tension between the feeling of diagrammatization and the feeling of, in some ways, that almost paranoid attempt to integrate everything. And lots of the work in the book, the magazine, discusses this, in some ways, paranoid tension, the feeling of trying to integrate too much, the feeling of being overwhelmed by reality. There's much more in the magazine. I really recommend people go and buy it, which I will send you a link to at the very end. But now let's go to this game, which I'm here to talk about, which is called How It Happens, designed principally by someone called, mysteriously, excitingly, Fum, and also by Mina Miller as well, who I mentioned earlier did the vignettes in the magazine. We all playtested it together at what we call Collapse Camp, which was about a year ago, in a place in France. We all physically got together, and it's designed, as you can see, by Marcelino Lagna, who is an excellent graphic designer who did, in fact, the entire magazine as well. And thank you again, as it says on the thing, to New Models, who funded this whole project. It was not actually printed in the People's Republic of China, as far as I am aware. I think we changed that at the last minute. So I've gone through this magazine. Here's some beautiful promotional shots, and I will describe for you now how exactly to play How It Happens. So How It Happens is a conversational card game, which means that the entire medium of the game is through conversation. The cards are entirely there as prompts. They're there to sort of be bounced off and played. At some point, I will show you a bit later this board game, this board which we made for the exhibition in Geneva, where you can place the cards on a sort of refracted version of the diagram that is behind me, also by Matisse Gross-Kaufmannis. But let's go back to the structure of the game. There are two main parts, or three main parts, perhaps. The first part is that you get a collapse type. So, of course, all collapses are multidimensional. All collapses necessarily contain a sort of indefinite number of dimensions, a sort of vast array of different things. But what happens in this one is that one goes through a particular, starts in a particular place. That might be an economic collapse, might be a narrative collapse, which is more abstract, difficult to in some ways engage with, a technological collapse, a social collapse, and so on. And so these are the different kinds of ways in which one can start this spiral that necessarily contains almost everything in the world. Then there are 6 world-setting cards. This process in which people go around the table one by one. Everyone has one card. If you play 6 people, if you play 4 people, of course you have 1.5 cards each, and you go back, and the first 2 people have 2 cards. These cards set things like when things are happening, where things are happening, how long they take, the scope of it. So the collapse that you're narrating, which is what the first part of the game contains, the collapse that you're narrating doesn't have to be the whole world, doesn't have to be some sort of global crisis like the one behind me. It can be in a single ecosystem, in a single house share. We've all probably experienced something like that. It can be in a particular town, or it could be vast, galactic in scale. Could be in the distant future, the collapse of some sort of galactic structure of politics in the year 3 million or something. And then what happens is the last part of this first one, we're telling a story of collapse, is that we have one collapse event each. These are quite nuanced, quite complicated. So I'm going to show you some of them. So I'm going to now shift over to the Figma board that I have prepared. I'm going to show you different kinds of collapses that are part of this. Okay, so hopefully you can now see that. Is that up here? Great. So you can see here that we have, and it's kind of the design challenge here. I'll just read this out. New extreme policy. A new policy was passed. It was viewed as an extreme measure. Describe the context of this policy and the reactions it provoked. Did this event make the impact of the collapse more or less severe? And so in some ways, the design challenge here is producing collections of events that are not necessarily, that can be applied to any kind of domain. So extreme policy, a mass mobilization wave, that could be a mobilization of anything, mass social organization, how did things change in terms of organization of society, infrastructure destruction, which is of course an incredibly crucial part of many collapses, and so on. I'm not going to go through all of these at the moment, but you can see here that we've got a kind of a flavor on collapse. We're putting some skin on the bones of this rather skeletal collapse that we established in the first few cards. Let's get back to the overall structure of the game. And now we get to the second really major part of the game, which is that we've told the story of the collapse, of how we go back. We're positioning ourselves as sort of neutral historians. That's the first part, where we're looking over this process of a collapse as it's happening, getting more detailed, getting more ideas added onto that sort of skeleton. And then the second half is my favorite half, which is when you enter the collapse as a character. You become a person who is playing through that collapse. And what that means is that you have to generate a sort of set of psychological motivations. So each person in turn will go around and they will say, okay, this is a collapse about, I'll give you an example from when we played it in Geneva. This person is the collapse was very sober, in some ways quite realistic collapse of glaciers in Switzerland and the way in which they feed the French river system. And what this leads to is a problem with nuclear power plants. So nuclear power plants have to be cooled by rivers. This is somewhat on the nose, given that this happened this summer as well. But we're in the distant future now, well, relatively distant, 2075 or thereabouts. And so the glaciers are very, very low. There's not much water going into the French river system. There's not much water being allocated. And there are semi-intelligent artificial agents, so artificial intelligent agents in this world as well. And they want the nuclear power plants to run in order to generate electricity to run themselves. And the humans in that world want the water to drink and not to cool the power plants. And so we have this political tension between these two different groups. And some people joined one side of the debate, some people joined the other side of the debate, other people were neutral arbiters, and so on. And we had to invent these whole sort of secret lives for them. So this join the world card is actually my favorite sort of fulcrum of the game, where you become a character yourself. Then you have the living in collapse things. Living in collapse are very similar in some ways to this thing up here, the collapse event. They're supposed to add a new sense of color, a new sense of framing onto the ideas that you've got in this collapse already. And then the question is, what do you do in the world? And the second part of the game is more discursive. So it's more, people say, okay, my character does this. In some ways, like a Dungeons and Dragons type game master relationship, although very little else of the game is like Dungeons and Dragons, I should be very clear. So people say, I will do this. And other people say, okay, you've done that, now I'm going to do this in response. And so the world it develops a sort of a politics in some ways. While this politics is going on, while people are playing their living in collapse cards, which are arranged around, for example, dimensions. So, for example, one of the living in collapse cards is about vulnerability. So who is the most vulnerable people in the world? And what is your character's relationship to them? Or how does mobility work in the world? How do people get around? And how do you as a character get around? So while that's happening, while you're going through these kind of multiple dimensions of collapse, another card is played, the Aftershock card. And the Aftershock card is a sort of another thing that happens in the process of collapse. So we might say that a bridge that we were relying on, that was the last bridge that we had, that also goes. And so the collapse has this sort of ongoing sense of a sort of punctuated equilibrium. We've got down to this low state, and then the aftershock takes us down again to an even lower state of social organization. But it could also be positive. It could also be going up. It could also be integrating things in the world. It could also be establishing a greater degree of control. And so those are the first two stages. The first stage, you tell the story of a collapse. The second stage, you enter into that collapse as a person and you live inside that world. Do you rescue the world? Up to you. Do you destroy the world? Up to you. Do you engage in a sort of complex political struggle? Up to you. And so there's nothing really determined in the way in which we relate to collapse. Much like, I think, and this is the relevance of this feeling of epistemic chaos that I'm telling earlier, much like I think you can't really determine what will happen in collapse. There's this feeling of freedom inside the game as well. The last third of the game is just a single card. It's a reflection card. And you return to your body, you return to who you are in this world in 2023. And you reflect on the process of collapse you've just narrated and look at the way in which you might restructure your life, engage differently, think differently about the world because of the collapse you just played through. And so it's a reflection card that allows you to re-embody the lessons that you are trying to work through in that collapse. The game deliberately has sort of frayed edges. It doesn't resolve necessarily unless you make it resolve. And this is what people call bleed, right? It's the feeling of sort of bleeding into other worlds. Some of the games that have been played, these are by the students of the aforementioned Matisse Gross-Kaufmannis. These are some of the worlds that they constructed. These are 3D renders by his students when they played through the game. This is a plant-based world. This, I think, is a soil or tree-based world. This is a rock-based world. This one also, the same as the previous one, the rock-based world. These are really beautiful renders. And they show just in some ways the different scope of things that can be produced through playing this game. Here you have trees, soils, plants. Here are their names. Thank you very much to them for playing through the game and for developing these beautiful things. These were in the show in Geneva. They were on the wall, these renders. Yeah, thank you. This is the game board, also by Matisse. It has no functional purpose, but when we played the game, we found that it lended a sort of a solidity, a sense of robustness to the game that it otherwise didn't quite have when it was just a card game. And what I love about this diagram, what I love about the board game, is this feeling of a certain degree of indeterminacy that feels like almost anything, you could do anything with this game. So you play a card, let's have a look, sort of play a card in this middle one, next to the known unknowns, or known knowns rather. Does that influence it? Does that not influence it? You know, there's a kind of an openness to the way in which you can utilize this thing. Here is that diagram that is behind me. This is my favorite. This is also in the magazine. And if you get the bundle version of the magazine as well, which I obviously encourage you to buy, you will get a poster, which you can see, well, you can't, but on the wall behind me. It's in the middle page spread of this. There are two kind of things I want to touch on kind of theoretically before I close the presentation. Kind of reflections on the way in which this game relates to the wider philosophy or understanding of games. And the first one is T.C. Nugent, his book Games, Agency as Art. And the principal argument of this game, of this book, not everything is a game. The principal argument of this book is that games are an art form, and the medium of the art form, in the way that surfaces are the mediums of painting and so on, or drama is the medium of the theatrical arts. The argument of this book is that agency is the medium which games sculpt as an art form. So this is when we play games, we take on temporary agencies, temporary sets of abilities and constraints along with temporary ends. We have a significant capacity for agential fluidity, and games make full use of that capacity. And I think what's interesting into this terms in this game is that in some ways the collapse is defined by the termination of a certain kind of agency. What critical collapsology, and this is the project that myself and my friend Bo, who wrote one of the pieces in the magazine, are now working on into a book-length project. What we think critical collapsology involves is this feeling of a sudden termination of agency, a sudden sense of the absence of something that was reproducing the world before. And in this sense, it allies with feminist accounts of social reproduction or critical infrastructural studies and so on, in looking at the way in which the world is made and remade in every moment by particular social processes that are hidden, and thinking about the way in which collapse offers a certain kind of disintegration of that. And so the question of how agency gets used in the game about collapse, given that we are taking on a new form of agency, is often to think about the exposure of those kinds of socially reproducing agencies and their sudden absence in the game world. And in that sense, it's a reflective process of thinking about the ways in which our lives are sustained. I want to touch very briefly as well on another theoretical touchstone for many people, Sian Nagai, and her really exceptional book, Our Aesthetic Categories, about 3 categories: the zany, the cute, and the interesting. And to note that when we played the game, very frequently people would come up with these kind of zany, crazy worlds in the first half, where something outrageous was happening, and then in some sense would fall apart in the second half when they weren't able to sustain the kinds of world-building practices that they might otherwise do. And my personal experience was that zaniness was a detriment to the interestingness of the game, to a feeling that the game could be persisted, to a feeling that the politics of the game were rich and interesting. And so if anyone's going to play the game, what I would encourage is a sort of sober reading or a sort of sober process of playing it. This is what Nagai says about the zany in an interview in Cabinet magazine. The zany is outperforming, intensely effective and highly physical. It is an aesthetic of non-stop action. You could say that zaniness is essentially an experience of an agent confronted by, even endangered by, too many things coming at her too quickly and at once, which is in some ways like the opposite of the kind of thing, or partially the opposite and partially exactly the same as the process of collapse that I was describing before, right? The sense that there's too much going on, too much to process, too much to engage with. This is another beautiful promotional shot for the magazine, and this is where you can buy it if you want to. The bundle includes the magazine, the card game, and the poster. You can follow us on Crude Features on Instagram, and we are currently writing, as I mentioned. There'll be a book project coming out, hopefully in the next 2 years, let's say. crudefeatures.substack.com. If you want to join the reading group for this project, then you can do so on the New Models Discord server. You can go to shop.newmodels.io, and somewhere on the website, there'll be a way to join the Discord as well. Thank you very much for watching, and that's me done.
Thank you very much, Richard, for the presentation. Maybe I start with some question. Ton micro est ouvert?
Yes, I think so.
Éteins voir, juste.
You want me to?
Yeah, switch. Because we are in the same room, and if there are 2 micros, it's really painful to hear your voice with a tiny second, nanosecond delay.
Yeah.
Yes, thank you very much. And also thank you very much for your participation to the exhibition. It was really nice to play the game around you and under your expertise. I've got some questions. So you said it was during the pandemic that you came up with this wheel of this community and reflect on bring this awareness about the social collapsing, and we saw that, and we all used those online platforms, and you use Figma in your presentation, but also with Samuel for the work for this exhibition, we use lots of platforms that allow us to work with distance. And my question is really simple. This one is why do a magazine, and why a game with physical cards and not a platform and not something else? What's this? The urge to have something physical, and also physical game, and not like later Troy will present and they write a book and they do a video game, but why card games?
It's a really interesting question. Yeah, I think that's really important. So one thing that I get from I'm now blanking on the name, but a very famous writer on collapse, he says that one of the only things that might survive a large-scale collapse are books. There are loads of books, billions of books, and cheap paperbacks will be one of the kind of the one thing that might survive a collapse. And I think the same is basically true of magazines. Magazines beautifully printed on very good quality paper. The card game, likewise, is a very robust object. And what I like about the feeling of physical objects, or these particular physical objects, is the feeling that they might themselves be quite collapse-proof. So in some ways, you might be able to communicate or sort of project in some ways these objects forward. And people might come across some of the card games, some of the card objects in a collapse. They might come across half of the deck with no instructions and be able to make their own articulation of what that game means to them right then. They might come across a dusty old copy of this in 25 years in someone's basement in a magazine. And this sense of communicating through time in these unexpected ways, I think, is quite an important aspect of a physical object, that it allows you to, in a way that most computer games, for example, will not be playable. I know you can get emulators. I know, for example, Rhizome, as the magazine has done a lot on this thing of problem of emulating things. But print media remains print media. I have books in this room that were 200 years old, right? Like, they remain 200 years old, and they remain robust for that. So I think that's the main sense of it. As to the why magazine and not sort of a single cohesive object, it's just that we didn't find a way of determining as much about collapse as we wanted to. And so we produced objects that felt like they were prisms. They're able to refract aspects of collapse in different ways, rather than trying to sum it up as a single unified notion.
Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. I have some. I hate the question of how to elaborate, but in our exchange with PHM, you mentioned it's also a term I don't really like, but the influence, so to say, or what games you draw inspiration from to develop how it happens as a conversational card games.
Yeah.
And you mentioned the game designer Everest Pipkin,
yeah.
and the games they develop, the ground itself and the world and the world ending games. So I would like to hear more about this, if you
yes.
Okay.
Absolutely.
And also maybe maybe we have a problem with narratives and storytelling, because I don't know, this is just something I'm throwing here a bit gratuitously and provocatively, but the question with all this role-playing game is that we are surrounded by stories that seems to mask or like to narratives are based on consensus, not veracity. And maybe, I don't know, but maybe games could also problematize storytelling and what trumps the truth. I don't know.
I completely agree. Yes, this is really interesting. So
because it's also with the fallacy of the diagram or the all these diagrams, these maps. They are made up. They are made up, and it's important to say that games are designed and made by people that have agency, and that game designer and
absolutely.
And there is ideology contained in them, or they call exhibit also these ideologies.
So Everest Pipkin, the ground itself, and the world-ending games, the principal things we took from them were the idea that the construction of the world was additive. So in the conversation game, and the Everest Pipkin, the ground itself game is really beautifully put together. It's a single sheet of paper, or it's a booklet, and you pass it from person to person to person to person to person, and then you have inside it you just read out the prompt, and then you fill in the prompt, and you simply say what happens next in that game, and it's obvious from the way in which the instructions are written what will happen next, and that means that you can't contradict other people. You can ask clarifying questions, but you can't say, no, you're wrong, that didn't happen, that's not part of the world, and so on. You can have this kind of sense of additiveness all the time. And what that means is that the world is everyone's responsibility. And people who go too far in adding too much of the world, or trying to be too opinionated about the world, and as I described before, zany, will have magical flying pigs, right? This kind of thing, right? They are responsible for the way in which that frustrates the gameplay of everyone else. And so everyone is constrained in the sense of just incrementalism. They have to just incrementally construct a world because there's no possibility of ever removing anything. It's also a democratic notion that you should just be able to not crush people, because that's frustrating in gameplay. I agree with you that narratives are bad. I know that's not what you said. I agree with you that narratives are vague consensus and not veracity. I think that the tension in the project, I should say initially that the first plan for the game was for a way of playing cards that would integrate themselves into an ongoing conversation. So I'd be having a conversation about collapse, and then these cards would function just purely as fulcra, or moments of turning, or moments of changing, prompts, questions, provocations in an ongoing conversation about collapse. And we abandoned that because we wanted something that felt more accessible and more sort of meaty in some sense for the players. But I agree there is this tension and this feeling that the narrative you are constructing is a sort of a fiction, is a sort of a nonsense that you are constructing, sort of fabulating or something. And I think that's what's so interesting about the reflection stage, is that you go back to yourself and you in some ways realize the feeling of this dream world. And if you do it right, the bleed, what I described as a bleed before, where the game world intrudes onto the real world, doesn't just happen one way, but the feeling that the whole world that you're in, even now, that seems to be defined by a graph a bit like this, or a diagram a bit like this, the whole world seems to take on the character of a sort of dream world. And so there's both a bleed in that direction, and a bleed in the sense that the fictionality, or the sense of narrative skepticism that one gets from playing the game should apply as well to your daily existence as a person in the world. And I think, yeah, absolutely. I think game functions as a kind of critical tool there, but and the two things you said go together, because you have to function as a critical tool because you have to have this additive structure, which makes you quite conservative in the way in which you construct the game. And that, I think, lets it reveal sort of its own narrative falsity, even as it sticks very closely to the real world.
Thanks. Can you? Am I audible?
You are.
Okay, because I was trying to see also, we have two canals on YouTube and on Twitch. If there's a question, you can ask for the people following, and I try to put some links, but somehow I can put them on YouTube. I don't know why, but yes, I think it's interesting. You mentioned also the book of Thai Nguyen, Games Agency as Art, published in 2020. And yeah, it would be interesting to reference them in the chat for people who didn't caught it.
Yeah, so this is the first game. I'll just put it again.
You put it on this. Okay.
Yeah, so Games Agency as Art. this is a really interesting book, a very interesting book indeed. And it has this very multi-layered analysis of what it's like to play a game, any game at all, and also some really beautiful descriptions of some really interesting games. And then
oh yeah, the cute,
the other one,
interesting. Yeah,
Our Aesthetic Categories is the name of the book. Cute, zany, interesting.
Great book.
It's really good.
Now, the notion of agency, I don't know, we have the time to talk because we are in advance on the program, is linked to the anthropologist Alfred Gell. Perhaps you're familiar with him.
No.
I will have to write it in the chat. But Art and Agency is one of his famous text, main work. Yeah, the idea of interaction was really problematized by art historians like Pamela Lee with New Games, and then later Claire Bishop with more on this idea of participation and interactive art through artificial health.
Yes.
And yeah, the way also we presented game in the exhibition was very ambiguous, I think, and it was also to expose this, what is a game, how the rules are made up, and to question the possibility of participation or attention, also with art installation, which are not performative, but we present traits or like aspects of games, but revealed to be inaccessible in one form or another, being behind the vitrine or being. So last Sunday was really interesting because there was a lot of children and they wanted to play with some of the pieces, but of course we had to. I mean, we couldn't because they were too numerous. But yeah, it's interesting to think about. Yeah, we have time to talk. I think like 10 minutes or something. If you want to add something, I can prompt you in some direction if you want.
So I just a thought on this. Yeah. Just a thought on
no,
this.
But perhaps the link on diagrams and games. But yeah, that's I'm opening doors which are maybe too.
No, this is a very important link, I think. I think that the reason why I like this diagram so much is that it offers the promise of completion, and at the same time fails to actually give that to you. And the prospect that I mentioned earlier of the card game being this physical object, which maybe you lose half the cards, and then in 25 years' time, someone finds in an attic, in a much warmer world, in a much maybe more collapsed world, they find
we can verify this in the studio of Christian. There's a lot of old card games from like
yeah.
Because we have a difference of generation. I don't know if I can advertise them, but this is like because we were just discussing that you live this era of post 2001 and Iraq invasion, which is like oddly similar to what we are encountering nowadays. And I thought it was I remember I was like 12 years old, 11 years old at this time, and it's interesting to discover someone who had another perspective on this stuff. And
I don't remember the.
I'm showing the ephemeras and stuff. I don't know if I'm allowed to, but
of course, yeah.
It's too late.
Yeah. Maybe c'était un those cards were made during the second invasion of Iraq, and they were used. It's all meant to kill of the regime. Each card is somebody, and you have some black figure, so they don't have the picture, but they have the name and things like that. And it was used as a portable also support for the. I just show you this one because you say after the collapse, the books. And this one is a survival kit, and the books is kept inside all-weather permanent, so it can go underwater and survive in the forest or things like that. But this idea also of the support is portable of the game, and they print the cards because the soldiers were also playing cards, and so they will learn to recognize the figure. So yeah, it's a support and it's a tool for memory. And with this idea of agency, and there is also this like affordance maybe of the game. Gibson, no, affordance. I think it's Gibson. Yeah, and but what interests me also is this idea of the shared space, because we play some other game that were world building. They were based more on the last year by Avery Alder, but they are all almost the same. You have some prompt of the game, and but yours, I must say, I get something more than the other world building, because yeah, you say Zani. In the beginning, somebody prompts something out of this world, and then you are stuck with this in the scenario, and you have to deal with it. And the reflect part, I think, was really interesting. But yeah, what touched me is also the shared care of the space. And with the card, with your card, I think it's more easy to take care of the space.
Yes, absolutely. I'm also very interested in the ways in which people might use the deck differently. So I can imagine a version of this diagram where you take off the words and instead you put the cards on. So, for example, this feeling of a sudden acceleration, and in some ways you could play for the next 10 years. Let me look at this Figma thing again. I'll show you the things that I mean. So, for example, you can see these. Let me show you the aftershock things. We have sudden darkness, a power outage, a swift act of censorship, or something else. A sudden darkness permeates the world. Describe its effects and reflect on some memory from the world before collapsed, not disclosed yet. And I feel like one could take exactly these cards. Sudden invasion, sudden halt, sudden burst, sudden acceleration. And one could give a pretty clear account of the life world that we're living in now, a feeling of a sudden acceleration, a sudden burst, certainly a sudden invasion. And so this reflection moment, yeah, is very, very crucial. But I'm very open to people taking a single card as a prompt for themselves every day. So, for example, my favorite one is intuitions. Consider your intuitions. How are your intuitions about the world changing now the world has collapsed? Are you sure of your intuitions? Do you find there are others who share your intuitions that might not have previously been aligned? And so there's a sense of shifting organization of the world. And you can not only play this in the context of the game, but also engage with it as a thing that you go through, kind of on a day-by-day basis. And so I think there's a kind of richness to that, like modularity in the game as well, that I think is for me quite exciting. Is the next person coming in?
Yes, I think we can stop. Sorry, because I
that's totally fine.
So stop anything. A quick question in the chat. I think we can. Oh, sorry, I have some feedback. I open. Yes, I think for the chat we should use Twitch for the participants, because YouTube, I don't know why, but I cannot enter stuff somehow. I'm sorry. I will try to. But Graete asked who's the author of the diagram, and I should know that behind you. But it's someone from the team. Is it Jack?
No, it's Matisse.
Matisse,
so it's Matisse Gross Kaufmannis. I can write that down if you want.
I will write it.
Difficult to spell, at least. Perhaps I'm not even pronouncing it correctly, but I have it on screen here. Let me just show you this. So you can see here it is.
It's also vaguely.
Yeah.
There was also a glossary, no, at some point developed. It's another project, the AstroTurf.
AstroTurfs for Offense.
Of Offense glossary, yes.
Yes, a very beautiful
But
project.
This was before Crude Future, but it's really.
This is before Crude Futures and not related to me. This was FUM and someone else, Jack Ritger, who made that.
Yeah.
I think that's a great project and has also some exceptional diagrams in.
Yeah, it was produced also by New Models, no? Because they have this mode of production where they found a project, and then the benefit of this project served to another project that would follow. And it's an interesting mode of to generate different work.
Yes, so this is the same thing for us. So when we were selling the magazine, we're giving the money back to New Models, and then they will use that money to fund a further project. So yeah, absolutely, there's a kind of a cyclicality to the way in which New Models works, which I think is really, really good.
All right.
Thank you so much to both of you for
thank you, Richard,
having me, and thank you to everyone for watching. Bye.
Bye-bye.
And so we're doing the transition with Matteo Menapace, if I pronounce it right. I'm trying to do somehow Italian accent.
Yeah, it's perfect.
So we approach you through Troy Veteze, who is not present here, if I'm not mistaken.
He should be joining.
Troy will join? Okay, great.
Yeah.
So I will present Troy first, perhaps, who is an environmental historian who specialized in environmental economics, animal studies, and energy history. And he authored, together with Drew Pendergrass, the book First Socialism, edited by Verso in 2022. And this writing developed through different project, I would say, and most notably a game, numeric game that you can freely download on the platform Steam. So Alpha Socialism. And we approach you, Matteo, who is the author of a game, Daybreak, on climate change, who is similar also to Pandemic. I'm not familiar to Pandemic, so perhaps we will be able to explain, but some of our listener or Christian even is familiar with it. It would be interesting to consider the link between ecology and simulation and games, and also games as a form of to participate to activist purpose. So game that might be not very playable, so to say, or might be even frustrating to play, but that exhibit the problematics that could be faced nowadays. So yeah, let's wait for Troy. Otherwise, I can also, I don't know.
Peut-être qu'il a une présentation libre, peut-être qu'il a une présentation et après Troy, non?
Yeah. How will the presentation be structured? Will you present together, or you do something apart? Is it more like a conversation, or you already have like a screen you would share?
Yeah, I've got a screen to share, and we planned for me to start and to talk about Project Daybreak for some 15 minutes or so, and then Troy should jump in and talk about Half-Earth Socialism, and then we want to wrap up with some considerations about our next project. Oh, there you go. Hi, Troy.
Oh.
Hello, Troy. Thank you for being here. Nice to see you.
Good to see you too.
So I just presented you very quickly, you two, and I think you can start right on time.
Okay.
Cool. All right, can you see my screen?
Yes, perfectly.
All right, cool. So as I said, I'm going to talk a little bit about Daybreak, then Troy's going to talk about Half-Earth Socialism, and then we'll wrap up with some thoughts and plans for the future. So when it comes to talking about games and radical politics, I always like to start with this game that I guess many people are familiar with, a game that is mostly known as Monopoly, but actually a game that started off as the landlord's game. And it was invented by the lady here on screen, Elizabeth McGee, as a political game, a game that was meant to help people understand a specific idea, help people understand the problems with the real world, and play out some of the potential solutions or the potential alternatives to the problems of the real world. So in her own words, McGee wanted to give people a practical demonstration of the present system of land grabbing. We're talking about early 20th century, the US, but it's something that we're probably all familiar with, to understand different approaches to property ownership. So she was campaigning for a policy proposal called the land value tax, which is about taxing the value of land, so that instead of having property owners and rentiers being able to extract value from that land and then just accumulate it, you would have distribution of that on everyone who lives and actually provides value to that land and to that community. So she could have written a novel or a play or another form of communication, but instead she decided to design a game so that people could actually test out those two models. So she actually wrote two sets of rules that would be played on the same board with the same cards. The first set of rule was competitive, and she called it a monopolist rule set, which probably sounds familiar because it was essentially what we know as Monopoly, where players were being encouraged to hold properties and to charge rent until you bankrupt everyone else, and then you're the winner. But also she wrote this cooperative rule set, which she called prosperity, in which she modeled the land value tax policy that she was campaigning for. So under the prosperity rules, every player gained each time that someone acquired a property as a way to simulate and to reflect the policy of taxing the value of land and then redistributing that value. And then the game was won by everyone, not a single player, but everyone, when the player who started out with the least money had doubled their income, so prosperity. And then what happened? So she patented this game. It was quite popular in the activist community in the US. And then 30 years later, in the 30s, the patent ran out and a games company bought that patent, essentially plagiarizing that game and repackaging it as Monopoly, which is, in my opinion, one of the worst games ever. Not just in terms of the message that it puts across, but also in terms of gameplay. It's a game where within a few rounds, people already know who's going to win. And it's interesting to notice that this was meant to be a game that made a point, not a game that was fun to play. But for some strange twist of fate, it became a very, very popular game. And I think it's interesting to reflect on how Monopoly represents, in general, a tendency in a contemporary capitalist society where games are competitive, are understood as competitive games, as competition between players, where the winner is the winner's gains are always balanced by the loser's losses. So our understanding of games tend to be narrowed by that frame of zero-sum competition. However, in recent years, in the last decade or so, cooperative games, the one that was scrapped from Monopoly, have been on the rise of becoming more popular. And I think that's interesting because in a competitive game, you tend to be focusing on outsmarting the other player. So you're kind of consumed by trying to be the one and only winner. Whereas in cooperative games, you're all working together, you're participating, you're strategizing, you're talking to each other, and that allows you to work together to address a larger problem, potentially a systemic problem, because the problem has to be encapsulated by the game structure itself. So moving on to cooperative games, this is a game called Pandemic, and it's a game that came out way before COVID-19 and has been one of the most popular cooperative games so far. And it's a game where you're working together as a team of researchers, medical scientists, doctors in the field, and so on. And your goal is to contain and then eventually eradicate 4 deadly viruses that are spreading around the world. And even though you're on the same team, it's actually quite a hard game to win. But the experience of playing it is very different from your typical board game because you're all working together. So you have to rejig your mindset and your style of play to make sure that this that you're actually working together to achieve this collective goal. So at the beginning of COVID-19, 2020, Matt Leacock, who's the author of Pandemic, wrote an opinion piece for the New York Times in which he laid out some of the lessons that you could learn from the game applied to COVID. And I had written at the same time, roughly the same time, a blog post on a similar topic. So I reached out to Matt on Twitter. We didn't know each other at the time, but we started a conversation, and we both realized that we were interested in the climate crisis. And so the opportunity to maybe join forces and work on a game about this came up, and we started to discuss what would be a potential game that is cooperative like Pandemic, but where the goal is to tackle a potentially even bigger, more complex problem such as the climate crisis. So our initial conversations revolved around our design goals. So what do we want from a game like that? And very important to be clear on what actually you want the game to be, because otherwise you could, it's such a overwhelming, complex topic that you could easily get lost. I for sure had before. I tried a few times before 2020 to see how I could model a game around the climate crisis, and I always found it very frustrating and very overwhelming. So at this point, we started by discussing our design goals, and came down to 3 really. The first one was that we wanted the game to frame the climate crisis as a global problem so that we can encourage players to explore collective actions and systemic solutions. Because one of our main frustrations was that often climate action is framed as an individual response to essentially a consumerist problem, where you're told to fly less, reining your consumption, and maybe don't have kids. So all things that you may do as an individual, but also shift the focus from systemic collective issues towards something which is only available to the individual. And that's something that we wanted to make sure we didn't do. So we knew that we wanted the game to have a systemic global frame. We also wanted it to be based on real world data. So to start from actual emissions data, the most recent that we could find, and try to model the system of emissions and the effects that emissions cause all around the world in both a scientifically accurate way, as well as a way that can be operated by a bunch of players around the board. So we have this interesting challenge, which is how can we be realistic, but at the same time, how can we make this model easy enough, simple enough rather, for people to operate? Because with a board game, you're essentially limited by the computing capacity of people's brains, and that is much less than the computers that run climate models, for instance. And finally, in terms of design goals, we didn't want to make an educational game. Now, educational games tend to have a reputation for being quite preachy, to tell people in a kind of sneaky way what is the right thing to do, and by doing that, limiting the choices that players can make. So we didn't want that. Instead, we wanted a game where people can implicitly absorb the complexities and the wealth of solutions that are available. Whether we agree or disagree personally with those solutions, that's not something that we wanted to like put on players, but rather letting them try, letting them make meaningful choices within the game, and then make up their minds for themselves about what is it that they want to do and what would they like to see happening in the real world. So with that in mind, we decided to start by modeling the problem first that people will try to solve. And essentially the problem that people are trying to solve is the cause of climate breakdown. If we really narrow it down to the main causes, greenhouse gas emissions are mostly produced by burning fossil fuels, which then trap heat in the atmosphere that drives up global temperatures and makes the weather more extreme and unpredictable and causes all sort of knock-on effects all around the world. So the immediate problem of global warming and carbon emissions, but then of course the emissions are not just happening naturally. There's a whole economical system that is driving this, and so we wanted people to focus on emissions, but also by doing that, understanding that in order to reduce emissions to a safe level, they have to not only tweak small things, but to make radical interventions to the way that the global economy is running. And so we called this layer, this foundation, if you like, the what is. So what is the problem? What are we up against? And then on top of that, we built a second layer, which we call the what if. So what if in reality we would have the power and the will to address the problem? And we know that the climate crisis has been quite marginal to the political debate for a long time, that we're not even allowing ourselves to imagine what could happen when a coalition of power that wants to tackle the climate crisis is in a position to do so. So the idea is to create a space where players can explore what is possible, and to do it on top of something which is as realistic as possible. So I'm going to explain briefly what is the layer, and then I'm going to explain how people can try and solve it. So each round, players are actually dumping on the board the equivalent of all the greenhouse gas emissions that are produced all around the world. And then some of those emissions are sequestered by natural sinks, such as oceans and forests. But the amount of emissions that we are generating globally is way more than what the planet can absorb. And so those emissions start to accumulate on a big thermometer on the board. And as they accumulate, they also lock in tenth of degrees of global warming, which we represent with those red temperature bands. So we start at 1.2, which is the current level of global warming, and then it raises quite quickly. And the higher the global warming, the more severe the consequences are going to be for players. So the consequences are mostly expressed through these crisis cards that people are going to resolve every round. And the higher the temperature, the more crisis cards they'll have to resolve. And also the higher the temperature, the more damaging each of those crisis cards is going to be. So we have a double escalation in the sense that there is a non-linear growth of damage and breakdown. So through the crisis cards, which represent a mixture of climate shocks, so extreme weather events, but also political, economic shocks that can be a result or that can be exacerbated by climate crisis. Players may lose the game through this. Now, what can players do about it? How can they try and solve this wicked problem? Well, the first thing we did when it came to the what if layer is think about who are the players, what are they representing? And because we wanted the game to have a global systemic frame, we decided to try and model players around the 4 superpowers of world powers that in the real world would have an actual ability to make a difference when it comes to this problem. So the first 2 were relatively easy, US and China, the main superpowers at the moment. Then we have Europe, both for historical reasons, but also because Europe tends to negotiate and to operate as a bloc. And then the majority world, which is a synonym for the global south, as the majority world, I mean, literally the majority of the people in this world who are also the people who are the least responsible for the climate crisis and the ones that are the most affected by it. So we wanted to give a seat at the table to the majority world and to try and model a challenging but empowering role for them. So what can players do? I'm going to go into a little bit more detail. So this is the player board. Every player has this board. On the board, they can they track various things. Those brown tokens with a zap, with an industry, and other symbols represent the emissions that are generated by that part of the world. And to reduce emissions, you can play cards. So, for example, the second card from the left on the top allows you to phase out dirty power plants, so to cut down the emissions that come from the electricity sector. And then the first card on the left, top left, allows you to build clean electricity, so replacing dirty electricity with clean electricity, and make sure that you're reducing your emissions whilst you're meeting the internal demand for electricity. And at the bottom of the player board, you can see that there are 3 rectangles where we have those shields, and those shields represent resilience, which helps players protect their communities from crises that impact either their society, their ecology, or their infrastructure. So this is how players can protect themselves from the crisis cards that I showed just a couple of minutes ago. And there are 5 cards at the top of the player board, which is the starting cards, so your initial set of policies. But each round you'll be drawing 5 or more from a big deck of 150 cards, which allow you to then roll out a wealth of policies, such as this. So, for example, when you draw cards, you can then play them on your board to build stacks, and those stacks can create benefits for each other. So when it comes to playing a card, so imagine that you have that high-speed rail card in your hand. You could either play it behind the stack to power up the existing policy on the front of that stack, or you could play it in front of a stack to shift the focus of that stack. Now, without wanting to go too much into the mechanical details of this, the idea that we ended up building into the game is that instead of worrying about money, there is no money in the game in terms of currency, or instead of worrying about political will, we decided that the main focus for this would be to to understand priorities and to understand the co-benefits between the different solutions, and to experience how new solutions can be built on the foundations of previous solutions. So that if you create something which is positive for people or for the environment, then it'll be easier to build on top of that, because the benefits will build up on each other and creating a feeling of momentum. This is a sample of all the cards in the deck. Not all the cards, actually. There's probably a fifth of the cards in the deck. But something that we also wanted to make clear is that there is no silver bullet. There is no single solution that always works, that always will allow you to win. Instead, there are many different solutions that are all working together, and that you can combine in many different things. And also, there isn't just the stereotypical climate solutions that people might be thinking of in terms of green electricity or efficiency measures. Those are definitely present. But then we have also other solutions that are about building resilient communities, restoring ecosystems, improving infrastructure, things like, for instance, universal healthcare, that someone might not immediately associate with climate policy, but that when played within the game starts to make sense as a way to build a better society, not just a greener society. So in conclusion, before I pass on to Troy, how do you win and how do you lose Daybreak? There are three ways to win. Sorry, there are three ways to lose the game. The two more obvious might be it's too late, so you haven't solved the crisis by the end of round 6, then you lost. If the temperatures get too high, you also lose. But the most likely way for people to lose is when there are too many communities in crisis. So those icons represent communities in crisis, people that are suffering, that are displaced, that are that disrupted their lives or their as a result of the climate crisis. And this is a way for us to center protecting people as a climate target. It's not just about emissions. It's not just about clean electricity or clean energy. It's about protecting lives. And so, in order to win, you need to make sure that you're investing in social resilience, infrastructure resilience, and ecological resilience to make sure that your people are safe, essentially. And the way to win Daybreak is by reducing your emissions to drawdown. So drawdown is essentially net zero and a little bit beyond. So when you have reduced your emissions to the point where the planet can absorb more than humanity generates, then you can start to actually take out carbon from the thermometer. And that's a really exciting moment, which represents an inversion of tendency. So for the last 200 years or so, we've been adding carbon to the atmosphere, and it's been accumulating. The moment where you start to take it away, a little bit later, the temperatures would also start to fall, and that means that we have curbed the growth of emissions, and we started to go on the right direction. So that's how you win the game. And I'm going to stop there because I could talk about this for hours, but I want to move on and let Troy talk about his projects.
Great. Thanks a lot, Matteo. Could you go to the next slide?
Sure.
Yeah. So I'm going to talk about my project, which is called Half Earth Socialism, next. And just to be clear, I wrote this book with a friend of mine named Drew Pendergrass, and we wrote this during the pandemic, and it was quite a lot of fun. And we wanted to imagine what life would be like in an ecologically stable society that was also fair. And this was like a thought experiment for us to really understand, you know, why are things so bad and what would it take to get out of the crisis. And this draws on some of my earlier work. I wrote this essay. I could go back, sorry. I wrote an earlier essay called To Freeze the Thames in 2018, and that basically set up this problem of land scarcity. That is, the environmental crisis is not just about climate. I mean, climate is very important, obviously, but we have to worry about several other problems. And these include having enough space, you know, for renewable energy deployment, because they take up more space than fossil fuels. We need to also worry about biodiversity and to make more nature preserves to prevent that. And we have to worry about natural carbon sequestration, which also takes up a lot of land. And I would later add that we need to worry about having enough space to prevent zoonotic disease emergence. So if we have intact biomes, then pathogens will not jump species as much. But all these things take land. So we worked on this project, which is very different from what I do as a environmental historian. So what my PhD was really on looking at the bad guys. I really was looking at neoliberals and what do neoliberals think about the environment, and I study them through the prism of intellectual history, where I studied neoliberalism as a project that could be traced to a small group of theorists, and one has to take their ideas seriously. Because I think people often write about neoliberalism as it's merely privatization or merely laissez-faire economics or just some kind of conservative class war and not an intellectual project. So I wanted to take them seriously and understand how they think about the environment. And I really found out that a lot of the ways we think about the environment now on the left and in the political center really draw on neoliberal ideas. So then the question for me became, what does a radical alternative framework look like? So this is where my historical work then began to inform my work on political theory, which is this Half-Earth Socialist project. Next slide. So the half-Earth is a concept that comes from several different conservationists dating back to the 1980s and 1990s. In the book, we go through a history of that. Probably, you know, the most important is E.O. Wilson, who people may be familiar with. He's a controversial figure, and we definitely don't espouse all his views, and we are critical of him and other conservationists in the book. But he does some important work on showing the relationship between territory and biodiversity, as in when a habitat loses territory, you also see a pretty consistent relationship in terms of loss of biodiversity. And this is a relationship of the fourth root. And that means that if you lose 90% of a biome, then you lose around half of the species. And then if you reverse that, so if you keep half of the biome, then you protect 90% of the species. So Wilson and other conservationists warned that we are on track to actually lose half of all species because we are only protecting 10% of the world in nature preserves. So we have to increase that ratio to 50%, which is the half-Earth. And this we thought was a useful framework because it really stressed the importance of biodiversity loss and a certain humility towards the natural world and the importance of land scarcity. So that's why we centered it. But we also are critical of conservationists, you know, for many reasons, but for their deluded belief that they could achieve such a goal within capitalism, because this is going to be extremely unprofitable. That's why we argue for half-Earth socialism. Next slide. So the socialism that we draw on, now we are both Marxists, but we are most interested in the work of someone named Otto Neurath. And Otto Neurath is a largely forgotten theorist, and he was quite important in the Bavarian Soviet Republic. He was the lead planner there. And here's a picture of the Bavarian Soviet Republic. This is just in front of the Munich train station. And this revolutionary government only lasted a few months, but his work on planning theory drew on his experience as a war planner and basically argued that socialist planning should not use money, and it should not use any kind of universal metric such as labor time or energy, and instead has to be based on many incommensurate physical units, such as watts or tons of steel or bushels of wheat. And we can only understand these incommensurate units in a totality. So we need to compare several total plans. And he compares this to war planning, right? Because certain war material are not commensurate with each other. You can have lots of guns, but no bullets, and that doesn't help you very much, right? You need to balance these things out. And you only can understand where you're going when you compare several different strategies. So he argued for this, and then this approach of seeing moneyless democratic planning where people learn to consciously control the economy also requires making the economy visible to people, right? So we need to have discussions of what we want to do with the resources that we have. What kind of life do we want to lead? What is our interchange with nature, and so forth. And next slide. And this approach to socialism was very controversial, of course, and it also spurred a reaction. And this is where neoliberalism comes from. So we have Ludwig von Mises, who was a conservative economist. He actually worked in the same office as Neurath during World War I and the war planning ministry. And he wrote a critique of socialist planning, saying without prices, you cannot have rational calculation, and therefore socialism is impossible. And then Mises' student, Friedrich Hayek, who some people may know, Hayek wrote a series of critiques of Neurath and other socialist theorists in the 1930s and 40s. And this is where neoliberalism emerges as the opposite of Neurathian planning, where neoliberals argue that the economy is essentially unknowable, and so we cannot intervene in it. And because of this knowledge problem, because we cannot know the economy, we cannot know the future or know our own needs, that we have to just have this faith in the market. And this becomes obviously the ideology that wins out by the end of the 20th century. But we want to return to this discussion between neoliberals and socialists, which is called the socialist calculation debate. And we see our work as a continuation of this debate. And next slide. So here we have Neurath, as well as his collaborators. So Marie Rademeister and Gerd Ernst. So Ernst and Rademeister were both artists. Ernst was actually part of the Cologne Progressive Group, who people may know. And what Neurath did following his release from prison after the Bavarian Soviet Republic was crushed, was that he decided to work on teaching or working with the working class of Vienna by showing them what the Austrian economy was like, by making the economy visible. Therefore, we can have these discussions. Next slide. So he worked with these artists on developing something called isotype. And if you have ever, gone to a restaurant and washed your hands and you see a little icon of hands underneath a sink, that is isotype. The isotype is how do we convey information efficiently without words. And Neurath was actually inspired as his work as an Egyptologist by looking at hieroglyphics. And he wanted to use these kind of graphic design to make the economy understandable to people who maybe had little formal education or even were illiterate, and to do so at a world scale. He actually wanted to develop these a global set of museums with someone named Pat Otley, who was a Swiss internationalist thinker. Next slide. So they developed a series of museums and exhibitions to show what the economy was like. Here's a picture of isotype being used in Mexico City. And this is really what inspired us for our game. And next slide. So we didn't have our own museum, but what we wanted to do was use Neurathian methods to think about showing what the environmental crisis was like and maybe solutions to get out of the crisis for many people. Next slide. And we don't tell people how to play, right? We give people options. Here you have a dashboard where you can see basically many different metrics at the same time, and you have to worry about living standards, you have to worry about the extinction rate, you have to worry about carbon sequestration, and then you're trying to, again, make these problems visible, see the interaction between them, and think about different solutions. Next slide. And again, we encourage players to look at a variety of ways to think about the environmental crisis. I think in most games, there's a mainstream kind of technocratic approach to, let's say, yeah, as Matteo was saying, like energy efficiency or electrification, but there's a huge variety of thinking from the far left to the, radical environmentalism. We want to represent that diversity in the game. You can play as like a follower of Frantz Fanon. You can play as an ecofeminist. You can also play as a Malthusian and try to draw down and reduce global population, or you can play as like a radical vegan who wants to make veganism mandatory. So we don't tell people what to do, but you can experiment and see these varieties and think of your own plan, your own total plan. Next slide. We did work. I did not make this game by myself, right? So we worked with a team based at the Jane Family Institute in New York, as well as the Trust Network in Berlin, and several researchers and musicians and so forth. And we put this game together, and we hope to have it come out with the book, so you can read the book and understand this kind of history, and also become your own planner. The goal was to really think about what would it look like to have like a social society, and we would have debates about the future. We probably would have a tool like the game to actually imagine, your own preferred total plan, and we would have debates about these total plans. And that's what the game was trying to do. And we put it on our website, so play.half.earth, and we also put it on Steam, where it was free. And I think it got a fairly good reception. So if I sold 10,000 books, which is nice, but it's only 10,000 people, the game, probably reached around 100,000 people. And I think it's about a question of scale. Like, how can we reach more people to think about these problems in their totality, and think about the relations between problems of decarbonizing agriculture versus geoengineering versus eutrophication and so forth. And so we can have more intelligent debates about the future, where, like Matteo, I was frustrated where people just talked about our own individual responsibility, our own individual actions. And sure, we have to change how we live, but we had no sense of like, what does my actions do and how does it add up to something, right? We need to have a sense of what kind of lives can we live where everyone can have a decent standard of living, but we also can reverse the damage in the biosphere. And that was missing, right? So the game was trying to build up those links between the very local or individual to the global, right? And next slide. So I'll talk briefly about our future projects, and Matteo, feel free to jump in. And we began talking because we both made games about planning and rewilding and things like this. And then we were saying, what could we make for another game, another project? And the way I saw it was, what problems do I want to think through? And what problems do I want to encourage other people to think through? I think this is what games can do, and this is how games can be different from books, for instance. And also think about questions of scale. So Matteo, his game will probably reach like several 100,000 or even 1 million people. So how can we get fairly radical ideas out into the mainstream as well? Next slide. So at first, we were thinking maybe we should work more on planning, and definitely the problem of planning has not been exhausted by us in our games. If anything, planning works pretty frictionlessly, as in if you want to do something, then it's done. And I think we need to actually maybe have games in the future where you have to worry about problems of motivation and information and international cooperation, or problems of having static maybe plans based on linear programming and more dynamic cybernetic mechanisms. How do these things connect? The planning is a very difficult problem, and games would be useful for thinking through that. But another thing we were thinking about was some kind of prequel. We both assume that we have this global cooperation, right? We both assume that we can consciously control the economy where we're not restricted by the problems of profitability, right? How does a transition actually happen? How does a revolution actually happen? This is a hard question. Next slide. There aren't that many examples of successful socialist revolutions, and not that many examples of a democratic revolution, and also few examples where it happened in industrialized societies. So I think there are some resources we can think about and use. We were talking before about Neurath and his connection to the Bavarian Soviet Republic. I actually find William Morris's writing and News from Nowhere very inspiring, where in that section of the book called How the Change Came, it's probably one of the first instances of a really gritty, realistic thought experiment of how a revolution could happen through strikes, civil war, and terrorism, and a final overthrowing of the bourgeois order. We can think about the contrast between figures like Castro and Allende. And then, of course, Rosa Luxemburg's work on the mass strike, and also her criticism of authoritarianism in the early Soviet Union are all things we can think with. But of course, there's many, many more examples, but these are the kinds of problems and approaches we want to draw on. Next slide. What's interesting is, again, I think what we're trying to do also is even these games are part of the socialist calculation debate, part of this debate between socialists and neoliberals. When I was researching for this talk, I actually was looking like what games do neoliberals like? And neoliberals have not made their own games, as far as I can tell, but there are some games that they do quite like, where they show the efficiency of markets, or they show how markets are not necessarily zero-sum interactions, or they model things such as a deregulated energy market, such as power grid. So you have this kind of neoliberal environmentalism in a game like that. And they weren't so interested in monopoly, but they really quite like Chinatown on the right. But there's, but we have to think, well, what is the socialist game? Next slide. And to be sure, there are socialist games out there. And this is only a small number. There's many more. We're also, Guy Debord made a board game. In terms of environmental games, there's plenty of environmental games. I mean, Buckminster Fuller obviously made a game as well. But we, I think, want to really have a game maybe that will deal with the difficulty of securing some kind of political hegemony at a moment when the left is weak and fascism is on the rise and centrists are becoming more authoritarian as well. While at the same time, you have to politicize basically an apathetic, middle of society, and deal with a worsening climate and environmental crisis. And then winning an election is not enough, as we have seen repeatedly. You can have even far left leaders win elections, but what can the far left do when it's actually in power, right? And these are also questions we want to think about. Next slide. So I'm going to wrap up here just so we have some time for Q&A. But I think what Matteo and I are really interested in is dealing with these difficult issues that have been plaguing the environmental movement and the left for quite some time, rather than merely ignoring them. Really imagining what another society can look like. And this is useful for ourselves to really think through these problems, because I don't know how a transition is going to happen, but maybe these games will be useful. But also, when I talk to my friends who were very involved in the environmental movement, they feel like they've run out of ideas, right? They feel like, we've tried mass demonstrations, we've tried plenty of other tactics, but we still are very far from real political change. And if our game can help people really think through these problems and use the games more as a kind of forecasting and simulation for political action, that would be extremely useful as well. So these are the kind of problems we're working with. We're very early on in this project, and we're very happy to hear from the audience. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Matteo. And thank you, Troy.
Can I start?
Yes.
OK. Est-ce que tu peux étendre le micro?
Sure.
Merci. Yeah, thank you very much. because I have to go to the exhibition to disinstall, open. I will start with my question, but maybe it's not well formulated, and maybe I've got more than one question. But I've got one stupid question first for Matteo, and then maybe another one more clever. You showed a Monopoly picture, and there was Extinction Rebellion instead of the O. It's original, or it's you made that yourself?
So this picture here,
Yes.
it's one that I snapped a few years ago in London. This was an advertising for poster advertising for Monopoly, where you can see a lot of brands all around it. I mean, Monopoly has been turned into this franchising where you can attach any brand, any kind of corporate property to it, and it still works because it's all about monopolizing their market. So you've got Disney Monopoly, you've got all sorts of monopolies, and then at the time, I think it was some Extinction Rebellion action, and someone just stuck a sticker on it, and I like it because also
perfectly.
Yeah, pretty much, and I think because it's subversive in the sense that someone has used the attractive qualities of that poster to then interject their own agenda, their own logo. But then one could argue that Extinction Rebellion is a brand as well, in a sense, and it has to work in this branded world.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you for this. And my other question was, Daybreak looks really promising. I will be happy to play it soon. But my question I try to formulate is more on the model and the modeling, but also on the worldview. And maybe it's also a question for Troy, because in this book, there is geoengineering, and in your cards, because if you read the IPCC, the GIEC report, most of the proposal, they include at one point geoengineering, and we know that beyond those projects, there are some huge actors like Bill Gates or Zuckerberg, or and in your game, do you have some cards for geoengineering?
Yeah,
you have
I
also.
thought. Yeah, we do have a bunch of cards that represent different types of geoengineering, and those have been some of the cards that we spend quite some time trying to balance, because what's interesting about those kind of still speculative, but as you mentioned, quite hyped technologies, is that on the one hand they are cheap compared to many other solutions, because they can be rolled out for a cost that would be relatively low compared to many others. But at the same time, the potential consequences, the risk and the unknowns that come from those are also really huge. And I think that they're being looked at, they're being considered because they could coexist in a world where we don't make any substantial changes to the way that the economy operates, so the way that power is structured and distributed. But there would be an artificial way to control the weather, if you like to. And what we tried to do in Daybreak is to show that there are these huge tensions in there. So people can play geoengineering, but it's a really risky strategy. And when it comes to using those cards, people usually play them when they are a bit desperate, when they've come to a point where it's kind of like a last ditch, and it's a big gamble that may play out temporarily. Another thing that we wanted to show is that it's also a type of solution that once you invest in it, you can't really switch it off, because once you started to pump, for instance, sulfur into the atmosphere or stratosphere, and you created this artificial clouds that block the sun rays, as soon as you switch them off and you haven't addressed the root problem, the temperatures will shoot back up. And so it's again, it's going back to the idea of, do we want to make a preachy versus a teaching tool, where personally I really don't want to see geoengineering happen in the real world. But from a games perspective and from a debate perspective of how do we understand the climate horizon, that we have to consider those, because there are some really powerful, rich people who are thinking about those, and so we have to try and model them in our conversations and our debates.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think also you say you didn't want to do an educational game, but at least it educates a lot of people about those questions. Maybe
yeah.
I'm sorry, I've got feedback from the microphone, but
yeah. So the reason why I say it's not educational is, you could say that every game is educational in the sense that it teaches you something. Like in Monopoly, you learn how to be the best monopolist. In Power Grid, you learn how to manipulate the competitive electricity market to your own benefit. So every game is educational in that sense. I think some games are more consciously educational. I think the reason why I'm saying we don't want to make an educational game is because there is a whole sector, if you like, a whole genre of games that are framed as educational, and those tend to be the kind of preachy games that are that tend to narrow the choices that people can make, so that you're almost forced to make what the educators think as the right choices, and that's the approach that we try to avoid. But of course, every game is an educational game in a sense.
I think we also both like games, so you want to make a game that's also fun, right? And
yes, yeah.
Just also for our own sake, I think. Like, you don't want to look at your own game and be bored by it. Yeah.
So, there's one question in the chat from Gaete about for Troy. Are you in contact with Joost Vervoort from NTC Play project? He works in exactly that area and could maybe a good contact for the game. I don't know if there's like a comment. So Joost Vervoort from NTC Play, but I will look. If you don't, I put it in the chat.
No, I think I know someone else who's told me to get in touch with that group, and I have to do it. So thanks for reminding me.
So it's like the massage.
Yeah, great.
Okay, I have a common question. It's not. I will see how it goes. But what strike me in your projects, Troy and Matteo. Well, basically, Troy, you start with the books and you say then there's a game to touch more audience. And basically, games, the way I think about it, are transmedia. And you cannot really isolate a game, because a game always implies as an object that there are an exteriority to it, and that there are maybe other games, or like you can tweak or change the game. So to me, the game is radically multimedia, and it have this subversive potential to go to or to imply other games. And I think it's an interesting way to think compared to the so-called climate crisis, which is a poly crisis. So the way you were describing, you started your presentation, is that there's a problem. Well, what is a problem? But at some point, you have to make the connection between different layers, dimensions, and scale, and you have to see how different systems or realms connect, and to acknowledge coexistence and interdependencies between them. And so the multimedia characters of games, and maybe these are a definition of games. I don't know. I would say it's trans-historical. I don't want to say it's universal, but I was struck also by maybe you're familiar with it, but in the 70s, the British Computer Art and Society Arts Society developed the eco game, who was presented in Davos. So it was inspired by cybernetics and system theory, and it's interesting because it was a computer controlled game, but it was really interactive and multimedia. So the game was not only happening on one room, but it was connected to also diversification of games. So now we think of add-ons and there was also this notion of alternate realities games. So the game is not only taking place in one so-called reality, but it's happening between different medium and different media. And so about the echo game, you can find this in a book, a recent book by Timothy Stott, Buckminster Fuller's World Game and its Legacy. I think it's 2022. And so I'm rambling a bit, but it's to say that, yeah, I think it's interesting maybe to the way you approach the environment. You're an environmental historian, but you have to deal with economics, with animal studies, with energy history. And so games might be, I don't know if it's a medium, but it implies this idea of transmedia and multimedia, and yeah, I think it would be.
Well, I just think about also.
So because this is what on the practical level, also linking with the question on the chat, is it's like you make the book, you now have made a numeric game. But together with Matteo, there is perhaps this incentive to develop more something like a board game or something. Yeah, it could be really transmedia as a project, Alpha Socialism.
Well, I mean, I think I'm sure Matteo feels the same way, but I think if you're working on environmental issues, you just want to preach, you want to get the word out. You want to have, I think, also a good conversation, and a certain frustration with how often we talk about these issues. And if the game reaches a certain audience, if the book reaches a certain audience, I give a lot of talks, but I think you want to get these ideas out there and have a more nuanced debate, because basically we've had this environmental crisis for a long time, but we still have very stupid discussions about it, and we have no real sense of what it's like to actually get out of it. Instead, we're talking about geoengineering, or we're talking about BECCS, like other net carbon energy systems. I mean, it's ridiculous, right? So I think this is part of the push. But also, I think if you look at Otto Neurath, I mean, he was basically an economic historian, right? And then he became a philosopher of science, and then he got involved in activism after World War One. He was very much involved in the allotment garden movement and people building, their own homes as cooperatives and all this. And then he got involved in graphic design, and then he kept doing things. Because I think once you have a kind of utopian project, you're just trying to imagine what that society looks like, but also you have to think about that society in its many different facets. And I'm just an historian. I have to work with people who know about the natural sciences, people who are good activists, people who know more about design. I mean, like it's always collaborative, and I'm always working on collaborations. But I think it's the nature of this utopian project leads to those kind of multidisciplinary thinking.
Mm-hmm.
And you need simulations. You need help, basically aids that will help you imagine this future. That's what these games are for.
Yeah, and I think that also one of the keywords that I think Troy mentioned is that having those conversations. And the reason why I used to be a web developer and I worked with more digital formats and video games too. And I moved away from that because I felt that often the medium, the technology in this case of video games tend to get in the way of having those conversations between people. So board games are a format where you're essentially facilitating conversations between people, especially when it comes to cooperative games where you're using cards, you're using various game elements, but the core experience is people talking to each other and using this complex system to talk through and to try and overcome a problem. And there's an interesting challenge there because in order to work, in order to be fun, in order to be engaging, it has to be also simplified. So it's about creating that model of a very complex system that exists in the real world, such as the climate crisis or many other systemic problems that you could make a game about, where people not only understand what the problems are because they have to physically move them around the board, but also they start to think about what can we do about them. And my frustration with video games often is that the computer, the game engine, does so much work for you that you're only kind of reacting, you're only sort of scratching the surface. Whereas even though the game model behind it might be much more complex, might be able to simulate much more in depth what you're trying to represent. But with a board game, you go to a point where you have to find a balance between what can we understand and talk about as humans between us, and how can we operate it without too much technology.
Yeah, because I mean, thank you for these answers, because it's always like that finding a balance between reaching an audience, making something fun, and presenting complexity. I don't have the power, so to say, to ask to formulate really what, but this idea of model and the link between historical link between ecology and simulation and computation, also game theory, and how the model modelize in French we have this word of modeler, like like a clay or something, like it's the observation also produce the what is observed, so to say, at some point. And okay, so nervous system. Okay, so Rock is here. I think we can switch for now. Thank you for your presentation, both. Let's stay in touch, because I think the what you will develop is really we're interested and we want to follow this. And Troy, we hope to see you if you happen to come by Switzerland, through Switzerland. Make us a call or a sign.
Yeah, I would love to come by soon. Yeah, sounds good.
We have to apologize. We have like flows of sugar and the afternoon, and we're dismantling the exhibition, but everything's fine. And thank you for being here.
We have some flags for you.
Okay.
Yes, we produce the flags. We made the flags. The propaganda flags are here with us in the office. I should have showed them. No,
I had a friend that came in and saw the exhibition. So I saw some pictures already. Yeah. Thanks so much. Thanks for the invitation, and I'll try to come by soon and see the exhibition and see you as well. Thanks for the invitation.
advertise. All right.
Yeah.
Okay, fine. All right. So, Rock, now, Rock, thank you for being here.
Thank you, Matteo. Thank you, Troy. See you soon.
You can stay. You can
Yeah.
stay. You can definitely stay.
I gotta run, but I'll watch it later. Are you gonna
Yeah.
upload everything online or?
It's
Maybe
gonna
not
be
today, but sooner later.
we're gonna edit a bit, maybe also. Yeah.
Sounds good.
Cool. Yeah, I also have to
Thank
run,
you
but
for
thank you
being
so
here.
much.
Bye-bye.
Yeah, thank you.
See you soon.
So now I present Rock Kranj, who was part of the exhibition with his game entitled Game Changers, the game, who was developed with Axioma, the Institute for Contemporary Art in Ljubljana, around 2022, if I'm not mistaken. So Rock is an eco-social transformation researcher. He translated several articles and books on the peer-to-peer foundation, participatory future, and statecraft and future statecraft. And yeah, his practice and research are in between design, experimental future, generative games, and other forms of engagement with alternative economies. So yeah, to us, you're quite interesting nod also because you connect a lot of different fields and people. I have also to thank you warmly because you were very informative for us about the link between games, art, and politics. We exchanged many references on this, and yes. I wanted to mention something else. I forgot. I'm so sorry. Yeah, I don't. Yes, I'll let you do the presentation. But just to mention that Game Changers, the game, you also produce and edited specifically for the show in Geneva a version, which will keep being updated. And it's something to be stay tuned with the evolution of this game because it's an interesting game that involves also some kind of participation with an audience, and the game. So the rule of the game changed as the game progressed, and it was really particular, I think, in the set of games we were presenting. All right, I'll let you speak. We can interact also in a more conversational manner. And yes, no, I want to say also that you know a lot about this interaction of games, and this was great for us to discuss with you. So.
Yeah, thanks so much for that introduction. It's a real pleasure to be here. And again, thanks to both for inviting me and also for this talk. So I will try to share my screen right now. Should be able to see it, right? Perfect. All right, so what I thought I would do for this short presentation is kind of walk our viewers a little bit through the history of the game, but also hopefully to give a sense of how one might create their own version of the game. It's kind of in the name, right? Game Changers, the game. And sort of finish off with a bit of a reflection on such kinds of open, localizable, generative, world-building, research-based, etc. games through this notion of game commons and what we could do through this kind of model. So yeah, what you see before you is like one of the this was in 2022 with Axioma, Contemporary Art Institute in Ljubljana. We organized this conference called From Commons to NFTs, and we decided to use this game as one kind of format through which we could discuss commons-based economics, both say from the perspectives of activists, critical researchers, and so forth, but also the game enables you to kind of get into the shoes of the other side, devil's advocate, capitalism, if you will, and so on. And another one, a bit more recent, this was a few months ago in Berlin. You can sort of see also the design progressing from year to year. Here we still see a kind of more monopoly-based assembly here, and it's sort of progressed into other forms, and we'll get to that in a bit. But yeah, it may be interesting to know that this has been in development for quite some time. This is an image from essentially the first event that I did with the game. In its kind of prototype form. This was in 2018 at the I think it was the 6th Degrowth Conference in Malmö, Sweden. So yeah, I'm not ashamed to say that initially, at least, I was kind of basing the design off of as you can see, monopoly in a way, right? There's lots of overlaps with it, and that is simply because, well, it may be a surprise that I'm not so much a board gamer or gamer in general per se. I did at least originally come more from the field of critical research into, let's say, alternative economies, broadly speaking. But then, through my studies and so forth, and kind of engagements with both, the fields of foresight and future studies, and then later on games and kind of game-based processes, I sort of tried to combine all these things in a kind of format that, to some extent, like my predecessors, I was looking for a way that would enable us to engage head-on with these all sorts of new economy / governance buzzwords, models that are springing up all over the place. And as a critical researcher, it's very, very quickly you will notice that there is this kind of discursive mimicry, contestation, co-optation going on around these terms and their meaning and their practical implementations and so forth. So it's essentially kind of quote unquote gamified discussion panel in a sense, where you can kind of step into the shoes of a capitalist, quote unquote, or on the other side, a commoner or a communist, quote unquote. But at the same time, you can essentially plug in any kind of seeming binary that you would like to play with. Green growth, degrowth, the hacker class versus the vectorialist class, and many other kinds of flavors here are possible. And this is kind of the closest to the version that you have there in Switzerland right now. And maybe it's worth noting at this point that although we're playing with these kind of seeming binaries, of course, the world in general is not so binary, but actually by virtue of taking on these roles in these kind of ideal, typical way, and throughout the gameplay, we sort of uncover the grays in between. Like the capitalists suddenly kind of start saying things that you might hear a commoner say, and vice versa. And I think, that's part of the intrigue of the game. So in terms of the game setup, like essentially, the first step would be kind of to ideate this kind of polarity that you would like to play with, what kinds of forces or even concrete real world people that the players would like to embody and is kind of relevant for what they would like to achieve with the game. And this is, just one example of a kind of configuration of the board, which is again fully open and modular, meaning that there are several options between which you can choose for your edition, but also, of course, you can plug in your own ideas and then make the game about that. At the same time, you could, here we have an array of various buzzwords, as you can see, like sharing, regenerative economies, social and solidarity economy, and so forth. And like, as you can see, like on the left, there's, let's say, this kind of standard version that I've been operating with, but also with the design, like as such right now, different configurations are possible, both in terms of the number of players, but also in terms of the number of playing fields and so forth. So it's quite adjustable in terms of the length of play and storytelling time that you give to the players and so forth. So this is just one example, let's say, of the kinds of buzzwords that you could choose from to plug into your edition. And these buzzwords essentially aren't too active in the game, so to say. It's more the playing fields that are supposed to be these kinds of examples of alternative economy models, initiatives, maybe even concrete organizations that you could argue from one point or another that they are contested or perhaps contestable. And indeed, for the exhibition in Switzerland, together with Christian and Samuel, we came up with this little configuration that you see. And it's also presented there as a poster on one of the walls in the exhibition space. And as I mentioned before, there's actually quite a few configurations that are possible. As you can see, you can play 3 versus 3 or 2 versus 2, 1 versus 1, and then depending on how long you would like to play, how many themes you would like to tackle with your discursive event, or however you can kind of pick and choose. And so the next kind of step in creating your own edition is kind of looking through the card sets that the teams use to essentially try to claim these new economy spaces, contested alternative economy spaces. And so the capitalists, let's say provisionally that we have teams of capitalism and communism. The capitalists use challenges, so they kind of, each player has a few of these cards in their hand, and the challenge that they're presented with is to kind of try to match the card that they have with the playing field that they wish to claim, and essentially come up with a creative storyline or sets of arguments or any other kinds of narrative strategies that would convince the audience in one way or another to vote favorably for you. And these are just some examples of challenges that are kind of based on my own research into these themes. And there are many more in the kind of standard set, which again keeps expanding as more events are organized and the more content is produced, let's say in the forms of cards or in the forms of playing fields. And these become options for future players to choose from. And again, they can plug in their own, and it keeps expanding almost as a kind of platform to build your own. And as mentioned, the communism side, on the other hand, then plays different kinds of interventions. So while the challenges are supposed to represent these kind of challenges, barriers, obstacles to transformative change at various levels, to some extent from various perspectives, with interventions, I mean, different kinds of either individual or collective strategies for genuine, whatever that means, transformative change. And so these again interventions can be based on art interventions or policy or research or media education, activism, etc. And so with these kind of card sets, like, you also kind of engage in a kind of collective sense making around the core challenges that perhaps you are facing in your own work in trying to realize radically alternative economic governance systems. And on the other hand, the different kinds of interventions that are at our disposal, be it based on real world interventions that have played out in various places around the world, or some may even be based more off of speculative ideas not yet realized, or may exist in some kind of prototypical or prefigurative form. And then there's also a third set, which I call wildcards. Actually, there's two types of wildcards. One on the left, you can see there's 3 examples, which are meant to be these kinds of external, quote-unquote, events that kind of influence this changed landscape. And as a wildcard appears, sort of, it could be favorable to one team, or it could hinder the other, and so forth. And what's on the card is more like the narrative. Then there are actual different mechanics at play, such as like the opposing team has to discard one of the cards that they have in their hand, or they have less time to tell their story and convince the audience to vote in their favor. And on the right, we have what I call scenario wildcards. So when a wildcard appears, say automation, there can be 2 scenarios that come out of that. And depending on what's the state of the board, if, say, capitalism has the upper hand, there's more chance that the capitalist scenario will unfold. In this case, people are working less, but are enslaved to capitalism more than ever. Whereas if the other team, the communists, would be in the lead, then the other scenario would unfold. Ergo, people have more time to co-create new economies. And as mentioned, at each event, actually before each event, I sort of work with the players, who are typically some kind of, you could call them representatives or visible figures in these kinds of alternative economy / governance spheres. And I think it's interesting that the game sort of puts them on the spot, if you will, to essentially they have to improvise, right? Or in a semi-improvised fashion, like create stories based on their experience, their knowledge. They're not there as the knower, kind of passing on their knowledge to those who do not know, but instead they're put on the spot to perform. And each time they do perform, I tell a story. The audience, which I call peer participants, in this case PEER and so forth, they get to essentially vote how convinced they are by the argument or storyline, and that kind of average result of the whole audience is mapped onto a dice roll, which is then the final decider if the strategy of one or the other team was successful or not. And so some of these cards come from players themselves. We work together to perhaps populate the game before the event with some challenges or interventions that are close to their heart or close to their practice and thinking. But on the other hand, before the event, typically also a general audience or potential audience members would have the chance, either through a forum or perhaps through social media, to contribute even more ideas. So there is this element of crowdsourcing ideas for game content that would fit the context or the purpose. And so you can see here some examples from Commons to NFTs edition, from the first image that we saw to down below for the Punk Gallery edition, the edition in Berlin, and from various other events. But it's also worth to note that besides the audience being able to vote in real time on the performances of the players, they also get to contribute new cards as the game is being played, and they are sort of plugged into the game. The players may, in the end, have to operate with your cards. So take it as a prompt to create their kind of compelling story. And there are actually, several other roles for the audience, which I won't get into too much right now. But through these various design efforts, and try to create several generative loops that kind of enable the creation of, let's say, a knowledge commons or a game commons that you can work with. That sort of brings me to this notion that I introduced briefly at the beginning of a game commons. And I thought it would be interesting to share this somewhat old school project. You can see from 2004, there were already discussions similar to what we're having now, in terms of how could we mutualize game resources and kind of have them be about progressive topics and so forth. And within this context, within game changers specifically, but also more broadly applying to any kind of open, localizable, generative game, I've been developing this model of a game commons peer production license, which is modeled after Creative Commons, but specific to how game elements can be co-created, shared, used, and attributed in such a context as game changers, where sources of game materials are all over the place. And it's also an interesting question of how do you give nods to these sources, as game materials from these sources are used to assemble specific editions. So for example, what I try to do is when we play a game and a player's card that they just played is based on an idea that has been submitted during a previous event, try to give a shout out to either that individual or organization that contributed it. And one could list many other examples besides game changers that work in this kind of fashion. And actually with Constanza Mendoza, who's also part of the exhibition and also had 2 workshops there, we had a small discussion while we were both there in terms of her game of kin, which kind of is also based on lots of hands-on research into different species and so forth. We're discussing Constanza and her collective's ambitions to localize this game, right? So to kind of engage with local actors, kind of create local editions of the game that play with, locally relevant species and so forth. But also others, for example, Red Plenty Games has an interesting game called the Social Strike game, which also comes in many variations and has lots of similar elements in terms of world building, storytelling, kind of prompt-based dialogue, and so forth. So a kind of a value proposition I see coming out of this notion of game commons is how can we kind of effectively make these game artifacts, shared and kind of really community based and community driven, and that you can shape them to different kinds of purposes and adjust them to different use contexts. And maybe a little teaser that we're also with some organizations working on realizing this game commons publishing model and an online platform that could support such game and knowledge commoning, creating this kind of genuine interoperative and open environment for game cultures with these kind of socially engaged or political topics. I think maybe at this point I will stop, maybe let you ask some questions. We can cover some more things from here.
Thanks, Rob. Christian, tu as une question?
Si tu éteins ton micro, je pose une petite question. Ah, voilà. Hello, Rock. Sorry, because we are... Ouais, merci pour le micro. Because we are dismantling the exhibition. I will be really quick, and maybe I had to listen to your, but later to your answer. But this game comments is very nice also, and no, I don't have a question now. I used to have one just before, but now I think it's gone. But it's more this idea like we speak about world building, and now I have the last year Avery Adler, a game where you start and suddenly I had an idea of a game or a mechanic that can be open source, and you can have a community using the same mechanics at one point, but they are feeding the content and the context of the game locally, and then you can exchange those and use the same mechanics. I think it sparks something in me, and also I must say that your game was really fun to play. I found it really fun, like it was a TV show, like a TV show format or something like that worked really good for the subject. I've got one small question. Just after you mentioned Constanza Mendoza, you speak about Red Plenty and social game. I don't get the reference, so maybe if you can put it in the share. And my question is, I will ask all participants, and but it's asking too much, I must say. Is the name of your game is Game Changer, and how, because we see that game help us to understand complex issue, or to map complex issue, to imagine other paths, and maybe to manifest relation or something. But how do, if a game changer, how do we change the game for real? Is it just community based agent? With Troy, there was this idea, or maybe with Crude Future, this idea of agency, and with Troy and Matteo, this idea of policy. How do we move from agency, because all game we like when there is agency, and how do we expand agency with game? This is my question, but I have to leave you. So I leave you with Samuel, and thank you for your answer.
Sure.
I will listen later. Bye-bye.
Sure, happy to. Yeah, maybe just a quick note on what you said at the start in terms of game mechanics. And this was an insight from colleague Pekko Koskinen, that interestingly enough, game mechanics aren't really copyrightable, which is an interesting kind of issue, but also perhaps a potential to kind of appropriate and use for different purposes. And you can see many game artifacts that slap on the Creative Commons license logo and be done with it, but actually kind of the reality of copywriting, or the whole organization around sharing and attributing and so forth, it can be a lot more complex. Yeah, I'll be happy to share the link to the Social Strike game regarding game changers, and how to potentially change the game with such games. Can maybe speak to the game at hand. There's maybe at least 3 meanings to the name. And one is, of course, that you sort of modify it each time you play it. And also we're talking about, potentially game-changing things, but also the game does, in fact, aspire to be a kind of game changer. And that is in terms of, let's say, public discourse shaping or policy discourse shaping. And my notion was, going kind of back to the start, or the intent of the design, is that we can head-on tackle, right, these mimicries or co-optations that are going on in the real world, right? When we speak about the sharing economy, we probably don't have Uber and Airbnb in mind, whereas perhaps maybe not today, but for the past 5 years, definitely policymakers and others would be hailing this as the onset of a brave new world of a sharing economy. And similarly can talk about this in spheres like the smart city discourses, and a kind of corporate smart cities visions, where you don't really know who's where the data is going and for what purposes, versus kind of activist open source, if you will, approaches, and so forth. And similarly, to circular economy, a kind of business-based circular economy versus an open source one. And my kind of idea is that as you have this kind of game, a platform, a game show, if you will, that kind of brings together these players in these spheres in the real world, and an audience that's in a in-person event could count 10, 50, maybe 100 people, but this game can also be played online, and also the audience can yeah, to the same extent, effectively participate in terms of voting, in terms of contributing card ideas and so forth. And my idea is that the more this game is played, and I think we sort of, when I say we, let's say, kind of the leftist inclined, or folks out there, that we need such kind of formats, that we need spectacles or anti-spectacles, if you will, to kind of counter this capitalist realism all around us, and kind of speculate on possibilities, but also kind of tackle head on the real challenges that we're facing. But if in the scenario that this game would be more mainstream, or as one of the formats that you can organize discussions, and if these become visible discussions, then I would imagine that it would be a lot harder for, say, defenders of the status quo in the real world, be it, right-wing politicians, or, business people, and so forth. It would be much more difficult for them to keep kind of, saying the same arguments, defending, one version of a smart city versus another, or these other things. So in that sense, I think it could contribute to real world change.
Well, thank you. A quick question in the chat on the Twitch channel. Your game is still in development, so to say. You play it through diverse venue. The last one was here in Geneva. But the question is, how do we get access to the game? And we discussed this. I think you were thinking of presenting it as a open, as a Creative Commons, online, perhaps. So could you tell us how do you see the future of the diffusion of the game? And
definitely, yeah. For now, it's more
and
like,
maybe a bit. You can do it a bit quickly, because we have to change
course.
the channel, to change the Zoom. But like 5-10 minutes. Thank you.
So yeah, for now, it's like, of course, people can reach out, and I can send materials, and I can even work with people or organizations to create their own editions, to tackle problems relevant to them. And indeed, it's much more difficult to do some kind of radical open source publishing model that actually gives you all the tools to create your edition and share content that you create with others and so forth. So that in itself kind of already requires a platform, online platform. It can also be analog, of course, but it does definitely help to have an online platform where these things can sort of come together. People can also contribute different kinds of metadata, for example, tags that kind of sort different cards based on what kinds of interventions are we talking about, what kinds of challenges, and so forth. And in some sense, it becomes almost kind of a distributed, at scale research project that's always living. So in short, it's a bit difficult for now to kind of put all these things out there, and that I would be happy with it. Of course, I could do that, but I think also with the work that we've been doing recently in terms of this platform development and so forth, I think we could count that within a year's time or so that this will be publicly available as a kind of interactive platform and knowledge hub to create your own editions, to plug in own content, share it, and modify it, contribute metadata, also share recordings of playthroughs. One notion that arises here that's interesting for me is that as a user of a platform contributes a card idea, then in the future that card may be used by players in future events. And then as you have, little clips or recordings of the whole events, but you can kind of isolate clips where that specific card is used. And as you maybe go on the platform and click, the profile of this card, you can see all the instances where this card was used, right? So, let's say that we have someone contributed this card of Kim Stanley Robinson writes the best post-capitalist fiction novel ever. And, you can see sort of, players from around the world at various venues kind of using this prompt in various ways in various new economy contexts. And yeah, and especially if, the card that you submitted is somehow really relevant to your practice, like by listening to others and how they use it through the game, that could actually inform your own real world practice.
All right, great. Maybe through some kind of website, but if people can follow you through like Twitter or X already from now, but yeah, or like Google your name and see only follow for the win. Let's see.
Sure, yeah.
We'll
For now,
advertise.
there's a Linktree, Futurescraft, which is the organization I founded. There's a Linktree. If you just Google Linktree Futurescraft, I'm sure you can find something where there's a list of previous playthroughs and so forth. And there's a good chance there will also be updates on the platform and developments around the license and so forth.
Okay, I put it right away. All right, thank you very much. I have to switch because we have we cut the afternoon in two, so I will for the participant following us online. Yes, they will have another session, but normally that should be automatically linked. I will see if I can manage to do it alone. Let's see. Thank you, Rock, again, and see you soon.
Thank you. Good luck.